Welcome to the Insight Meditation community of Charlotte. I'm Ward Simmons. I'm one of 6 Dharma leaders that rotate responsibility for leading each Wednesday night. Welcome to all of you on Zoom. So as you may be aware, this evening we will continue our series on the 5 precepts. So 2 or 3 times a year, we set aside several weeks in a row where each teacher talks about the same topic so that we can go in more depth than we can just in a 20 or a 25-minute talk on one Wednesday night. So these 5 precepts that we're exploring, and we began last week, Thea spoke about the first precept. These precepts are to refrain from these 5 unwholesome behaviors: killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, incorrect speech, and intoxication. So tonight we're at the second, the refraining from stealing. And this is the most frequently used way that precept is phrased. I undertake the training precept to refrain from taking that which is not given. So sometimes you'll see this phrase slightly differently depending on who's speaking. I prefer to include the term freely given. Which addresses coercion. So if something that is given but is not freely given, is given as a result of coercion, that really is a violation of this precept of non-stealing. So if you are familiar with the precepts, you may know that they're not the same as what is more familiar to a lot of us, a commandment. But instead, precepts are freely undertaken. They're training rules. They're really aspirations. And when we fall short of those aspirations, which we will, we don't need to go ask anybody to forgive us for that. We learn from the experience of falling short, and that strengthens our resolve when we encounter a challenging situation in the future. And over time, our behavior becomes more aligned with these aspirations. So I'd like to start by just looking at where the precepts fall within the teachings of the Buddha. If you're familiar with the teachings of the Buddha, these will fall right into place. I hope it's useful. If you're not so familiar with the teachings of the Buddha, just take what's useful. Over time, this will start to fall into place for you. And there are 3 teachings that I think are particularly relevant to the second precept on non-stealing. The first one is the 3 defilements. The 3 defilements. So those 3 defilements are greed, hatred, and delusion. And those are understood to be kind of the natural tendencies of the untrained mind. Another way to say those a little less dramatically is desire, aversion, and ignorance. So stealing is an expression of greed or envy, one of the 3 defilements. And the opposite of greed, the opposite of greed in this situation would be renunciation or generosity. So when we practice renunciation or generosity, not only do we not take the possessions of others, but we also voluntarily relinquish possessions that are recognized as our own. And in this way, we cultivate a mind which is not craving possessions, either our own or those of others. So the first teaching, greed, hatred, and delusion, and non-stealing aligns with that very nicely. The second teaching is the Four Noble Truths. And if you're not familiar with that, this teaches us, the first thing it teaches us is life contains unsatisfactory moments. You will hear that referred to as suffering. Unsatisfactory moments as well as beautiful moments. So unsatisfactory moments are not a mistake, it's just a part of the human condition. The second of the Four Noble Truths is there is a reason this happens. There's a cause for the unsatisfactoriness that we experience. And that cause is attachment or clinging. The third is to the extent that we can release our attachments, we will have a release in unsatisfactoriness, a reduction in suffering. And then the fourth is there's a way to get there. There's a set of instructions. There's a path that leads us to being able to release our clinging and our attachment. And that is the Noble Eightfold Path. So as you can see, the third noble truth, which asks that we renounce our attachments, does that sound familiar? That would be renunciation, or it would align with not stealing. In the context of this precept, we cultivate a deeper and a deeper commitment to these Four Noble Truths. And the reduction in this attachment that accompanies them makes it less possible that we might steal. And kind of correspondingly, the more committed we are to non-stealing, the easier it is to develop these Four Noble Truths. So that's the second way this second precept aligns with one of the Buddha's fundamental teachings. The third way is the Noble Eightfold Path itself. So this teaching gives us those instructions, these 8 specific steps that we can, or factors that we can use to uproot our attachments. How do we get from here to there? These 8 factors. And they're divided into 3 groups, and I'm just going to take a moment and say them. Some of you are familiar with it, some of you are not. In the context of this training that we're doing, they would be as follows. There's a group for ethical behavior, and it includes wise speech, wise action, and wise livelihood. There is a group for mind training or meditation, and that includes wise effort, wise mindfulness, and wise concentration. And then there's a group for wisdom or insight, and those are wise view and wise intention. And so ethical behavior is where the precepts fall. And within that group, wise action is the path factor that specifically includes the precept on non-stealing. Also includes non-killing, which Thea spoke about last week, and also not engaging in sexual misconduct, which will be our topic next week. So in summary, the second precept is addressed in many of the Buddhist teachings, but these 3 that I mentioned are the 3 defilements, the Four Noble Truths, and the Noble Eightfold Path. So now that we've got it kind of located, this precept located within the teachings, let's look a little bit more at exactly what it means in our behavior and our day-to-day lives. Why would we want to undertake a commitment not to steal? Why would we do that? The most common answer is that it creates safety for all members of society. Folks don't have to lock up their possessions to prevent theft. And this fosters a sense of trust and goodwill among members of the society. People can rest easy without fear. So this may sound somewhat utopian, and theft has always been around. But it was not so long ago that it was a little bit uncommon in our culture, not as common as it is today. I grew up in the 50s and 60s, and I had an aunt who lived in the next town over. Some of you may be old enough to remember this, but there was a time when cars didn't have ignition keys. You just got in the car and you stepped on the accelerator, and that engaged the starter and the engine started. Then you put it in gear and drove away. Well, my Aunt Jane was a little absent-minded, and she'd been to the grocery store, and she got in her car and drove home with her groceries, and she pulled up in the driveway, and my Uncle Jimmy said, "Whose car are you in?" And she said, "Is this not my car?" He said, "No, take that car back and give it back and bring your car home." So she went to the grocery store and she parked it and she found her car and she came back home. Now, that's maybe hard for us to imagine nowadays, but that was the way it was not that long ago. So maintaining social order without so much theft is a good reason to avoid stealing, but this is an externally focused reason, and it's not the best reason. The greatest benefit is the effect that not stealing has on our own minds. And that's an internally focused reason. So I was once at a retreat. Some of you may be familiar with Christina Feldman, and she was teaching a retreat that I was at. And she was speaking not about the precept of not stealing, she was speaking about loving kindness. But here's what she said. She said, "I am the primary beneficiary of my acts of goodwill, no matter to whom they are directed." I'm the primary beneficiary of my acts of goodwill, no matter to whom they are directed. And I think we can say the same thing about the precepts. I'm the primary beneficiary of my wholesome acts that align with the precepts, no matter to whom they are directed. So the precepts really benefit us most of all. So circling back just for a moment to the Noble Eightfold Path, the sequence of those three groups of path factors that I mentioned, ethical behavior, mind training, and wisdom, that's not a coincidence there in that sequence. The basis of our progress on this path is the first group, ethical behavior, where the second precept falls. As we gradually refine our behavior, we experience less guilt, less regret, less rationalization for our behavior, and less blaming. And if you don't believe me, just check what's going on in your mind the next time you meditate. How much of that self-talk up there is explaining or rationalizing or justifying some action on your part that maybe you're not quite satisfied with. So the result when we refine our behavior is an untroubled mind. It's a calm, clear mind that is fertile for the practice of meditation. The practice of meditation being the second group of path factors. And the practice of meditation is the basis for the arising of wisdom or insight, the third group. So, and that is the culmination of this path to awakening. So when we follow the precepts, we refine our ethical behavior. It's foundational for our progress. In his book, 8 Mindful Steps to Happiness, Theravadan monk and teacher Bhante Gunaratana put it this way: "Do not think that you are refraining from stealing to please the world. You are doing it for your own contentment now and in the future." So having placed the second precept in the teachings and having talked a little bit about how its practice might be useful, why we might want to pursue it, I'd like to turn our attention to how we implement it. So the classic understanding of this second precept, not stealing, is somewhat narrowly construed. Clear examples of violations would be housebreaking or car theft, purse snatching, or conducting some kind of online scam. It would also include less obvious examples, such as not paying your share of income taxes, expecting that somebody else is going to do that for you. Theft of smaller items is an equal violation of the precept. So while an employer may not notice that some office supplies are missing, or a neighbor might not realize that some of the fruit from her tree is missing, the corrosive effect on ourselves, the internal effect, is the same. So those are some actions that we must abstain from to follow this precept. Adhering to the precept also has an affirmative side to it, which is an obligation to correct obvious errors on the part of others. If a store clerk fails to ring up an item, then we should bring that to his attention. If we find something of value, we must use reasonable efforts to figure out who it belongs to and return it. And we should do so without any expectation of reward or recognition. So those are all about tangible items, but let's move on to broaden that out a little bit. It would also prevent us from stealing intellectual property. For example, downloading music without the artist being compensated for it, claiming credit for others' work, writings, quotes that are not properly attributed. Theft of time from one's employer would likewise be a violation. So I know you can't see this. This is a cartoon that Gail, my wife, and I saw in a little restaurant up in the mountains when we were traveling in our RV. It's this guy, and what he's saying is, when I get to work, the first thing I do is hide, because they say a good worker is hard to find. I don't think this guy's complying with the spirit of the second precept. So these are the narrowly construed understandings of the precept. But let's look at a little more expansive understanding. Some people would advocate that we should expand it. And this would be based not on what the Buddha said about what happened during his time, but what he might say if he were here with us today. So there's always an element of risk with this kind of speculation. We humans are inclined to interpret things the way we want to get the answer we want. The history books are full of religious wars that I doubt the founders of those religions would have condoned. Still, a strong argument can be made for applying the precepts to our current circumstances in ways that align with the original teachings, even if the Buddha didn't specifically address these circumstances. So back to material possession, some will make the argument that by having too much, the well-to-do are actually stealing from the needy. And here we'll need to take the radical step of putting aside our cultural embrace of capitalism for a moment. In days gone by, these well-to-do people would include the Vanderbilts and the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds. Today, they would be Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, and myriad others that could be named, even though they may use part of their wealth for worthy causes, there's still a vast amount that's not being shared. So these are the words of Basil the Great. He was the bishop of Caesarea, and it was around 365 current era. When someone steals a man's clothes, we call him a thief. Should we not give the same name to one who could clothe the naked and does not? The bread in your cupboard belongs to the hungry man. The coat hanging unused in your closet belongs to the man in need. The shoes rotting in your closet belong to the man who has not shoes. The money which you hoard up belongs to the poor. If all of the resources we have all saved, including our retirement accounts, were suddenly made available to those in need, the impact on the human suffering on this planet would be dramatic. The reduction in suffering would be dramatic. So maybe we should all just close our bank accounts and put all our money in a basket on the front porch. And then anybody who needs money can just come get it. And if we need money, we can go get it too. And I'm not idealistic enough to think that this is going to happen anytime soon, but I think it illustrates the point. There's enough for everybody if we didn't do what we do, which is hoard it. So there's the issue of right sharing of the world's resources. Wealthy countries reap the benefits of land and minerals, clean air and clean water, and those with less wealth bear the brunt of the environmental damage. Past and current generations consume more than our fair share. And what does that leave for future generations? So returning to a more expansive understanding of non-stealing, what should we think about a nation that continues to spend more than it takes in with no realistic expectation of paying it back? This simply creates a crushing debt for future generations. And what about the theft of the dignity of marginalized people? Racial minorities, sexual minorities, those with physical or mental disabilities. Can this be considered anything other than taking what is not freely given? Our race is haunted by multitudes of talented individuals who, because of the circumstances into which they were born, never had the opportunity to develop their potential. So I'll offer one more example of a broadened understanding of non-stealing, and that is of time, which I'm on the verge of running out of. When we fail to respect others' times, and we are not taking what is not freely given? If I go over my allotted 25 minutes for tonight's talk, that's a violation of the precept. Arriving late for engagements or meetings so that the time of others is taken from them. Not paying attention to others so that their words are wasted and they have to repeat themselves unnecessarily. Being unclear in emails and other communication so that the other party is burdened with repeatedly following up to clarify. Some of the examples of a more expansive understanding of the precept. I'll close with 2 points. One of the wonderful things about this practice is, in my view, it doesn't give us all the answers. It really presents us with questions. It invites us to look inside and find answers for ourselves. The Buddha said, "Here is what I have found. Come and see for yourself." And this is a process, and it's a lifelong process. When we first start practicing, we look at our behavior. Precepts are all about behavior. And then we look at our aspirations, how we would like for our lives to unfold. And over the course of our lives, most people find that those move closer and closer together. They begin to converge. And so as we look at these questions that I've offered tonight, I can't tell you how to resolve these, but hopefully they'll be useful as you explore the teachings and begin to merge your behaviors with your aspirations. The second thing I'll say is I'm not sitting up here telling you that I've got all this worked out. The reason I'm bringing these topics up is because they're very much alive and active for me. They are unresolved for me. And so I'm interested in seeing resolutions to whatever extent we can have them. And I invite you to engage with them. I hope they're useful too. So I will offer this for your consideration.